Everyone ignored the injured ginger cat after the crash. But one elderly woman, Eleanor Ainsworth, lived a life measured in quiet moments. The ticking of the grandfather clock in her hallway, the gentle rustle of leaves outside her window on Sycamore Lane, the soft clink of her teacup against its saucer, these were the sounds that defined her days. At 82, her world had shrunk, not in a way that felt diminishing, but in a way that felt concentrated. Her late husband, George, had been gone for 10 years, and their only child, Sarah, lived across the country in California, a continent away both physically and emotionally. Sycamore Lane, in the small town of Havenwood, Pennsylvania, was usually peaceful. Lined with old oak and maple trees, the houses were a mix of well-maintained Victorians and modest bungalows, each with a small, neatly tended yard. Eleanor's house was a bungalow, painted a pale yellow that had faded with time, just like her memories. She had a routine unchanging as the seasons. Mornings began with a cup of Earl Grey tea and a slice of toast with marmalade. She'd tend to her small garden, filled with roses and herbs, a legacy of George's green thumb. Afternoons were for reading, knitting, or watching the birds at her feeder. But the nights had become a problem. Havenwood was a sleepy town, but it had one unfortunate claim to fame. A long, straight stretch of road just outside the town limits, known locally as the Drag. For years, it had been a magnet for young people with fast cars and a reckless disregard for speed limits. Lately, it had become worse. Motorcycles, loud and throaty, roared through the night, their engines echoing through the valley and shattering the peace of Sycamore Lane. Eleanor hated them, not just the noise, which made her heart pound and her hands tremble, but the fear they instilled. She worried about accidents, about young lives thrown away in a moment of foolish bravado. She'd called the sheriff's office more than once, but there was little they could do. The racers were quick, elusive, and the road was just outside their jurisdiction. She found solace in her small companions. Not human companions, but furry ones. Eleanor had always loved animals. Over the years, she'd had a succession of cats, each one a cherished member of her small family. Currently, she had none. Her last cat, a calico named Patches, had died of old age 6 months ago. The house felt emptier without her. "Maybe I'm too old for another pet," she told Sarah on one of their infrequent phone calls. "Mom, you're not too old for anything," Sarah had replied, her voice tinny and distant through the phone. "But maybe a cat is a lot of responsibility. Have you thought about a bird?" Eleanor had sighed. A bird wasn't the same. She missed the warmth of a cat curled up on her lap, the soft purr, the gentle kneading of paws. One warm evening in late September, Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping her tea and watching the fireflies begin to dance in the twilight. The air was still, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle. She closed her eyes, trying to savor the peace before the inevitable roar of the motorcycles began. She was thinking of George, remembering a time when they'd sat on this very porch, holding hands and watching the stars. A tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. Loneliness, she realized, was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long and deep in the quiet hours. She knew tonight the roar of engines would interrupt her peace. The first motorcycle ripped through the night like a jagged tear in fabric. Eleanor flinched, her teacup rattling in its saucer. She gripped the arms of her wicker chair, her knuckles white. It was always the same. A single bike, a scout perhaps, testing the road. Then, a pause, a brief respite that was more agonizing than the noise itself because she knew what was coming. And it came. A wave of sound, a cacophony of engines, a chorus of speed and recklessness. They were closer tonight, she thought, their roaring engines vibrating through the floorboards of her porch. She could almost feel the heat, the smell of exhaust fumes. She stood up, her legs shaky, and went inside, shutting the windows and drawing the curtains. It did little to muffle the noise. She turned on the television, hoping to drown it out, but the bland chatter of a game show only added to her anxiety. She paced the small living room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She thought of calling the sheriff again, But what was the point? They'd arrive long after the racers were gone, leaving only the echoes of their noise and the lingering smell of burnt rubber. Suddenly, there was a different sound. A screech of tires, a sickening thud, and then silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than the roar had been. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. Had there been an accident? Had someone been hurt? She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and a strange, compelling need to know. She hesitated. It was dangerous out there. Those motorcyclists were reckless, unpredictable. But she couldn't stay inside not knowing. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, her hand trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool against her skin. The street was deserted, eerily silent. The only sound was the chirping of crickets, a sound that seemed strangely out of place. She shone the flashlight down the road, its beam cutting through the darkness. She could see nothing. She took a few tentative steps onto the sidewalk, then a few more. The silence was unnerving. Then she heard it. A faint, high-pitched whine, almost imperceptible. It was coming from the side of the road, near the overgrown ditch that ran along the edge of her property. Eleanor moved towards the sound, her flashlight beam dancing nervously. She pushed aside a tangle of weeds and saw it. A motorcycle, lying on its side, its chrome gleaming in the faint light. It was one of the racing bikes, sleek and powerful. But there was no rider. The whining sound came again, closer now. Eleanor lowered her flashlight, and there, in the beam of light, she saw him. A cat, a small ginger cat, lying motionless in the grass. The cat was a mess. Its fur was matted with dirt and what looked like blood. One of its legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were closed. Eleanor knelt down, her old knees protesting, and gently touched the cat's side. It was still warm. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered, her voice trembling. She carefully scooped up the cat, cradling it in her arms. It was surprisingly light, fragile. As she stood up, she heard voices in the distance. Headlights appeared at the end of the street, approaching slowly. The sheriff, and probably the ambulance. They were coming for the motorcyclist. Eleanor looked down at the cat in her arms. It whimpered softly, a tiny, heartbreaking sound. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that no one else would care about this small creature. The focus would be on the rider, on the accident, on the consequences of the reckless race. The cat would be forgotten, an insignificant casualty. She made a decision. She couldn't leave it there. She wouldn't. She turned and hurried back towards her house, her steps quicker now, fueled by a sudden surge of determination. She ignored the approaching headlights, the shouts of the officers. She had a mission. Inside, she laid the cat gently on a soft towel on the kitchen table. She turned on the bright overhead light and examined it more closely. The leg was definitely broken. There were cuts and scrapes on its face and body. It was breathing shallowly, its chest barely rising and falling. Eleanor felt a wave of despair. It looked so bad. She didn't know if it would survive. But she had to try. She filled a small bowl with water and held it to the cat's mouth. It didn't respond. She dipped her finger in the water and gently dabbed it on the cat's lips. Still nothing. She found an old, clean washcloth and dampened it with warm water. She carefully wiped away the dirt and blood from the cat's fur, working slowly and gently, murmuring soft words of comfort. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. "You're safe now. You're with me." As she cleaned the cat, she noticed something else. A small silver collar around its neck, almost hidden beneath the matted fur. There was a tag, but it was too dirty to read. Eleanor carefully cleaned the tag. It was engraved with a single word, Rusty. So the cat had a name. That made it seem even more vulnerable, more real. She wrapped Rusty in a clean, warm towel and held him close, rocking him gently as she would a baby. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, a longing for connection, for something to care for. It was the same feeling she'd had after George died, after Patches died. A deep, abiding need to nurture, to protect, to love. She sat there for a long time, holding Rusty, listening to his shallow breathing, praying that he would make it through the night. The sirens had faded away. The commotion outside had died down. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence was different. It was a silence filled with hope, with determination, with the fragile beginnings of a bond. The world outside, with its speeding motorcycles and reckless disregard, seemed far away. All that mattered was this small, injured creature in her arms, and her unwavering commitment to save him. The next morning, Rusty was still alive. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Eleanor had barely slept, checking on the cat every hour throughout the night. She'd made a makeshift bed for him in a cardboard box lined with soft blankets, placed near her own bed so she could hear him if he stirred. He hadn't moved much. He still hadn't taken any water. But he was breathing, and that was enough for Eleanor to cling to. She made herself a cup of tea and sat beside the box, watching him. His ginger fur, now clean, glowed softly in the morning light. He looked so small, so vulnerable. She knew she needed to get him to a vet, but she was hesitant. Vets were expensive, and she was on a fixed income. George's pension and her Social Security were enough to cover her basic needs. But there wasn't much left over for emergencies. But this was an emergency. She couldn't let Rusty suffer. She looked up the number for the Havenwood Animal Clinic in the phone book. Her hands were shaking as she dialed. Havenwood Animal Clinic, how can I help you? A cheerful voice answered. Eleanor explained the situation, her voice cracking with emotion. She described Rusty's injuries, her concerns, her limited financial resources. The receptionist, a woman named Susan, was kind and understanding. Bring him in, Mrs. Ainsworth, she said. We'll take a look at him. Don't worry about the cost right now. We can work something out. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. Susan's kindness was a lifeline. Getting Rusty to the clinic was a challenge. She didn't drive anymore. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. She called her neighbor Mrs. Henderson, a retired nurse who lived 2 doors down. Mrs. Henderson, a stout, no-nonsense woman with a heart of gold, agreed to drive her. At the clinic, Rusty was examined by Dr. Miller, a young, compassionate veterinarian with gentle hands. He confirmed Eleanor's fears. The leg was broken, and there were several deep lacerations. He also found evidence of internal injuries. He's in rough shape, Mrs. Ainsworth, Dr. Miller said, his voice grave. We need to run some tests, take some x-rays. It's going to be expensive. Eleanor swallowed hard. Just do what you need to do, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. I'll find a way to pay for it. Dr. Miller nodded. We'll do our best for him. He's a fighter, I can tell. Eleanor stayed at the clinic for hours, waiting while Rusty underwent a battery of tests. She sat in the waiting room, clutching a worn copy of a magazine, her eyes unfocused. She was praying, remembering George, remembering Patches, remembering all the animals she'd loved and lost. Finally, Dr. Miller came out. The x-rays show a clean break in his femur, he said. We can set it, put it in a cast. The lacerations need to be cleaned and stitched. There's some internal bleeding, but it seems to be minor. We'll need to keep him overnight for observation. Will he be all right? Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Miller hesitated. It's hard to say, Mrs. Ainsworth. He's been through a lot, but he's young and he's strong. With good care, he has a chance. A chance. That was all Eleanor needed. Leaving Rusty at the clinic was one of the hardest things Eleanor had ever done. The small, empty box in her living room was a constant reminder of his absence. She felt a pang of loneliness, a familiar ache that had become a part of her life. She busied herself with chores, trying to distract herself. She cleaned the house, weeded the garden, prepared a simple meal she had no appetite for. But her thoughts kept returning to Rusty, to his fragile body, his closed eyes, his faint, shallow breathing. She decided to call Sarah. It was a Saturday, so there was a chance she might be home. The phone rang several times before Sarah answered, her voice sounding breathless. "Mom? Is everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't want to burden Sarah with her worries. Sarah had her own life, her own problems. But she needed to talk to someone. She told Sarah about the motorcycle race, about finding Rusty, about the vet visit. She tried to keep her voice light, to downplay the seriousness of the situation, but her emotions betrayed her. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said, her voice filled with concern. "That's awful. Poor kitty. Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "The vet says he has a chance, but it's going to be expensive." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor knew what Sarah was thinking. Money was always tight. "Mom, I can send you some money," Sarah said finally. "It won't be much, but it might help." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with a familiar pang of guilt. She hated asking Sarah for help. "Thank you, honey," she said. "But you don't have to. I'll manage." "No, Mom, I want to," Sarah insisted. "It's the least I can do. You're always doing so much for everyone else. It's time someone did something for you." Her words surprised Eleanor that she started to cry. Eleanor spent the rest of the day restless and anxious. She visited Mrs. Henderson, thanking her again for the ride to the clinic. Mrs. Henderson, a widow herself, understood Eleanor's loneliness and her attachment to animals. "He'll be all right, Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson said, patting her hand. "Animals are resilient, and you're a strong woman. You've been through worse." Mrs. Henderson was right. Eleanor had been through worse. She'd lost her parents, her brother, and her beloved George. She'd faced hardships, setbacks, disappointments, but she'd always found a way to carry on. She'd learned that life was a tapestry woven with both joy and sorrow, and that even in the darkest moments, there was always a thread of hope to cling to. As evening approached, Eleanor called the clinic again. Susan, the receptionist, answered. "Rusty's doing as well as can be expected, Mrs. Ainsworth," she said. "He's still sleeping a lot, but he did take a little bit of water. Dr. Miller is pleased with his progress so far." Eleanor felt a small flicker of hope ignite within her. He'd taken water. That was a good sign. She went to bed early, exhausted but unable to sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the house settling. She thought of George, imagining him beside her, his arm around her, his steady presence a comfort. She remembered the day they'd brought Patches home, a tiny, shivering ball of fluff. George had been so gentle with her, so loving. He'd had a way with animals, a quiet understanding that Eleanor had always admired. She drifted off to sleep, dreaming of ginger cats and green gardens, of quiet evenings and the comforting presence of loved ones, both human and animal. The next few weeks were a blur of vet visits, medication, and anxious waiting. Rusty came home with his leg in a bright blue cast, a cone around his head to prevent him from licking his stitches, and a list of instructions that seemed overwhelming. Eleanor followed Dr. Miller's instructions to the letter. She administered the pain medication, the antibiotics, the anti-inflammatory drops. She changed his bandages, cleaned his wounds, coaxed him to eat and drink. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Rusty was a difficult patient. He hated the cone, he struggled against the medication, he refused to eat most of the food Eleanor offered him. But she persevered. She spoke to him in soft, soothing tones. She stroked his fur. She sang him old lullabies that George used to sing to Sarah. She spent hours sitting beside his box, simply being there, offering him her presence, her love, her unwavering support. Slowly, gradually, Rusty began to improve. He started to eat a little more, to drink more water. He purred occasionally, a faint, rumbling sound that was music to Eleanor's ears. He even started to tolerate the cone, though he still bumped into things occasionally, sending objects crashing to the floor. The bond between them deepened. Eleanor found herself talking to Rusty constantly, sharing her thoughts, her memories, her worries. He became her confidant, her companion, her furry little shadow. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor was sitting on the porch, watching Rusty hobble around the living room. He was still clumsy, still favoring his injured leg, but he was moving with more confidence, more energy. He paused in front of the window, gazing out at the garden. Eleanor watched him, a smile playing on her lips. She remembered the first time she'd seen him, lying injured in the ditch, overlooked and forgotten. Now he was here in her home, a part of her life. He suddenly turned and looked at her, his green eyes meeting hers. He let out a soft meow, a sound that seemed to convey gratitude, affection, a deep and abiding connection. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. She reached out and stroked his fur, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her hand. "You're a miracle, Rusty," she whispered. "A true miracle." The financial burden of Rusty's care was significant. Sarah had sent her some money, which helped, but it wasn't enough to cover all the bills. Eleanor had to make some difficult choices. She cut back on groceries. She stopped buying new clothes. She even considered selling some of George's old tools, a thought that brought tears to her eyes. But she didn't regret it. Not for a moment. Rusty was worth every penny, every sacrifice. He had brought joy back into her life, a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. One day, a letter arrived from the sheriff's office. It was about the motorcycle accident. The writer, a young man named Jason Miller, no relation to the vet, had been seriously injured but was recovering. He'd been charged with reckless driving and speeding. The letter also mentioned that the police had been unable to locate the owner of the ginger cat found at the scene. They assumed it was a stray. Eleanor held the letter in her hands, her heart pounding. She looked at Rusty, who was curled up on her lap, purring contentedly. She knew she should probably contact the police, tell them that Rusty had a collar, that he might have an owner. But she couldn't. Not yet. She wasn't ready to let him go. She needed him, and she believed, deep down, that he needed her too. She knew the time would come, and prepared herself for the heartbreak. The cast finally came off. Rusty's leg was still a little weak, but he was walking, running, even jumping with surprising agility. He was a different cat than the one Eleanor had found in the ditch. He was playful, affectionate, full of life. The cone was gone too, and he spent hours grooming himself, meticulously cleaning his ginger fur. He'd chase dust bunnies, bat at dangling toys, and curl up on Eleanor's lap, purring like a tiny motor. Eleanor cherished every moment. She knew their time together might be limited. The thought of losing Rusty, of having to give him back to his original owner, was a constant ache in her heart. One morning, Eleanor was reading the local newspaper when she saw a small notice in the Lost and Found section. Lost, ginger cat, male, answers to the name Rusty. Silver collar with tag. Missing since late September. Reward offered. Please call. Eleanor's heart sank. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading. She read the phone number, her hands trembling. She looked at Rusty, who was playing with a ball of yarn, his tail twitching with excitement. He looked so happy, so content. She hesitated. She could ignore the notice. She could pretend she hadn't seen it. No one would ever know. But she couldn't do that. It wouldn't be right. Rusty had an owner, someone who was probably missing him terribly. With a heavy heart, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. A woman answered, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Hello. Hello," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "I'm calling about the lost cat, Rusty." There was a gasp on the other end of the line. "You found him? Is he all right?" Eleanor explained the situation, about the motorcycle accident, about finding Rusty injured, about the vet care, about his recovery. She left out the part about her own emotional attachment, about how much Rusty had come to mean to her. The woman, whose name was Karen, was overwhelmed with gratitude. She'd been searching for Rusty for weeks, posting flyers, contacting shelters, driving around the neighborhood calling his name. "I can't thank you enough," Karen said, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I'd lost him forever. He's my son's cat. My son, Michael, he's autistic. Rusty is his best friend. He's been devastated." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, mixed with a profound sadness. She understood. She understood the bond between a child and an animal, the unconditional love, the comfort, the companionship. They arranged for Karen and Michael to come to Eleanor's house the next day. Eleanor spent the rest of the day trying to prepare herself. She gave Rusty extra attention, extra cuddles, extra treats. She told him how much she loved him, how much he'd meant to her. She cried, silently, tears of grief and gratitude. She was grateful for the time she'd had with Rusty, for the joy he'd brought into her life, for the reminder that even in the twilight years, there was still room for love, for connection, for purpose. The next day, Karen and Michael arrived. Michael was a shy, quiet boy with bright, intelligent eyes. He looked at Rusty, who was sitting on Eleanor's lap, with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. "Rusty!" he cried, his voice filled with emotion. Rusty looked up, his ears perked. He seemed to recognize Michael's voice. He jumped off Eleanor's lap and ran to Michael, rubbing against his legs, purring loudly. Michael knelt down and scooped Rusty into his arms, burying his face in his fur. He was crying, but they were tears of joy. Karen watched them, her eyes filled with tears as well. She turned to Eleanor, her face etched with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving him. Thank you for taking care of him. Thank you for giving him back to us." Eleanor smiled, a bittersweet smile. "He saved me too," she whispered. Karen and Michael stayed for a while, talking, laughing, sharing stories about Rusty. Eleanor learned that Michael had gotten Rusty as a kitten, a gift from his parents to help him cope with his anxiety and social challenges. Rusty had been his constant companion, his confidant, his furry therapist. As they were leaving, Michael turned to Eleanor, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Thank you for being Rusty's friend." Eleanor knelt down and hugged him. "He'll always be my friend," she said, her voice thick with emotion. After they were gone, the house felt empty, silent. Eleanor sat in her chair, feeling the absence of Rusty's warm body on her lap, the silence of his purr. She cried again, tears of loss, tears of grief. But beneath the sadness, there was a sense of peace, of acceptance. She'd done the right thing. She'd given Rusty back to his family, to the boy who loved him and needed him. And she knew, deep down, that she would never forget him. He had touched her life in a profound way, reminding her of the enduring power of love, of compassion, of the unbreakable bonds that connect us all, both human and animal. The roar of the motorcycles might still occasionally shatter the night, but within the quiet walls of her home, Eleanor had found a different kind of roar, the quiet, purring roar of a ginger cat who had healed her heart, and in turn, found his way home.